Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for those lovely words. My name is Jim Evans, and I am a lead member of technical staff. That's my title, or lead software engineer at Salesforce. I'm also a core contributor to the Selenium project, and the parts of the project that I'm responsible for are the .NET language bindings. So if you code in C# or VB.NET or even F#, then you're using code that I'm responsible for maintaining and enhancing. And I'm also responsible for creating and maintaining the Internet Explorer driver. So if you've run any tests against Internet Explorer, once again, you're using code that I'm responsible for, and for that I greatly apologize. But I want to take a few minutes this morning just to chat with you a little bit about the open source project Selenium, which I'm sure we're all familiar with and we've all been using, and what the future holds for the Selenium project, and what's next sort of in the upcoming weeks and months and years. And before we talk about where we're going, I think it's always important to kind of take a few minutes to step back and look at where we've been and how we got to where we are today, because that often informs the path that we take forward. So, and Selenium in particular has a really rich history associated with it. And so let's just talk for a few minutes about where we've been and where we've come from. So billions and billions of years ago, so sorry, that's a little wide angle. I know I'm channeling Carl Sagan there. And so that's a little too wide angle. So let's narrow it down just a little bit. And let's talk about Selenium 1. And Selenium 1 was created by Jason Huggins, who has been mentioned already today. He's here today. He's here this week. He's here today and tomorrow as part of the conference. It was created in 2004 at ThoughtWorks, where he was working at the time. Does everybody know the story of how Selenium got its name, by the way? It's a pretty funny story, and I'm gonna kind of paraphrase or tell it a little bit, and I hope that Jason will, if I get the details slightly wrong, will kind of wait until later to correct me on them and not do it in front of everybody. But so ThoughtWorks at the time had a time and expense reporting application that needed some testing, and needed testing both in Internet Explorer and Firefox at the time, because developers being developers don't always want to use necessarily what the corporate overlords say you have to use in terms of tooling. And so he came up with this idea that was originally kept the test steps in an HTML table. This is an architecture for which Hugs has apologized in the recent past. But at the time, ThoughtWorks had a product that it was pretty famous for. It was a CI system called Cruise Control. And so he came up with this project, this automation system that he wanted, that his original name for it was going to be check engine. Because he was thinking automobile parts, cruise control, the check engine light comes on, and he sent an email internally to some folks who were kind of helping him around with this project, and nobody would respond to the email, and then suddenly people started coming by his office and saying, "Tell me about this Selenium project." And he's like, what Selenium, what are you talking about? And then it turns out that one of the people on that email thread had started looking at names for the project, and one of the popular automation tools at the time was WinRunner, which was made by a company called Mercury Interactive. And they had gone online and they had done some searching, and they had found some quack doctor somewhere that said that the cure for mercury poisoning was taking selenium supplements. So that's where the project got its name. The architecture of the project, it was originally, like I said, HTML table-based, and eventually evolved into including a library that you could call, using regular code statements, that was known as Selenium Remote Control or Selenium RC. It came to include a suite of other things like a record and playback tool called Selenium IDE, which was implemented as a browser extension for Firefox. It became, the Selenium Remote Control Server evolved a grid mode where you could parallelize your testing out, which is one of the direct precursors for SauceLabs. And it kind of became the open source alternative to commercial web automation tools. And that's the Selenium 1 release, was kind of what we call Selenium RC these days. How it worked was it loaded up the web page that you were automating in a frame set, and used JavaScript to automate the page inside the other frame. And that was great, but it had some limitations associated with it. For example, you're limited by the JavaScript sandbox, for one thing. And as browsers became more and more advanced and more concerned about things like cross-site scripting attacks, because having somebody being able to load your page in a frame and then inject malicious stuff into your page was probably not the best thing that you really want to have happen to your website. There started to be some security challenges with keeping that going and making that a viable thing. The other thing is there's some challenges also with things like fidelity of events. When you're using JavaScript to simulate a click or a right click or a drag and drop or whatever, you have to be very careful to make sure you're emitting the same types of events that would happen if the user actually moved the mouse over and started to do drag and drop. And that's a bit of a challenge. So in 2008, also at ThoughtWorks at the time, a gentleman by the name of Simon Stewart, and we'll talk a lot about him over the course of the next few minutes or the next little bit, created a new way, a new approach for browser automation, and he called it WebDriver. And some of the ways that he and Jason Huggins kind of interacted as far as the WebDriver thing goes are pretty interesting, and I encourage you at some point to seek him out, because Jason is a fantastically great storyteller, and I say go seek him out sometime the next couple of days and have him tell you some of those stories about him and Simon and the steel cage knife fight. He's a much better storyteller than I am, I'll be honest with you. But I'm up here right now, so you have to listen to me. After both Simon and Hugs had moved on to be employees at Google, they came to the conclusion that probably the best thing to happen was to have the WebDriver project to merge with the Selenium project and become one project under the Selenium banner. And that happened in 2009. The code bases were merged. They all came together under the Selenium banner. This is long about the time that I started getting involved with the project. I became involved with the Selenium project just after the code merge had happened. And the advantages of WebDriver are that it's not limited by the JavaScript sandbox like Selenium RC was. And it was more focused on automating a browser like a real user would. That is, using OS specific mechanisms to simulate mouse clicks and keyboard events and so on, to give you that better fidelity of what actually happens. One of the innovations, and Selenium, in 2010, Selenium 2 was released. And Selenium 2 was the release that introduced WebDriver as part of Selenium to the world. It was the public release that did that. One of the innovations that came from the Selenium 2 timeframe, and that helps to make things like remote execution possible and enables us to use SauceLabs and all of these kinds of things, is the invention of a wire protocol for automation. And the project chose a JSON over HTTP protocol, and originally it was the communication mechanism between just a language binding and the Firefox driver that was created by the Selenium project. And eventually we came to the idea that, this is actually a pretty good way to do things, and expanded that to be the mechanism for communicating with all of the browser drivers. It was then taken up by the Internet Explorer driver, and eventually taken up by the Chrome driver, and that was one of the big innovations of the Selenium 2 release, Selenium 2 timeframe. Interestingly, the reasons that JSON and HTTP were chosen, there have been some people who said maybe that's not the best technical, from an architecture, the coolest way to communicate across processes, but nearly every programming language on the planet has an HTTP client library that can make HTTP calls. And nearly every programming language on the planet has a JSON parser library. So what that means is that it makes it very, very easy to write a WebDriver language binding in just about any language you would care about, because it's based on these two very common technologies. Now, in the early days of the Selenium 2 release, we had kind of a rapid release model. We were putting out a new version every week, just about. And that was fine as far as it went. Things started to slow down a little bit as things matured, and we didn't have quite as many bugs, and we didn't have quite as many new features that we had to develop. But there were some interesting other things that started to happen. And at the first Selenium conference in 2011 is where kind of the first of these big things happened. And it was that a browser vendor, in this case Opera Software, they released their first implementation of a driver for their browser. This was mind-blowing at the time. I can't tell you how stoked we were to hear this, because if the browser vendor is going to go and implement all of the hard work, then that's stuff that we don't have to do. Awesome, fantastic, that's less work for us. And then at the same conference, the Chromium team, sponsored by Google, which is the open source project that leads to the Google Chrome browser, demonstrated a Chrome driver as well. So we started to see the ball rolling towards browser vendors creating their own drivers for the browsers that they create. So that was an amazing thing. This really fantastic. I cannot emphasize how mind-blowing and amazing this was for those of us who worked on the Selenium project. Fast forward a little bit, and toward the end of the Selenium 2 time frame, Mozilla started to get in on the act in creating a Firefox driver, which is called Gecko driver. And it has some roots in their attempt at a mobile operating system, and so on. They wanted to use some technologies to do that, to automate that. And that became Gecko driver, and that started to be available as an automation mechanism toward the end of the 2.x time frame. Which leads us to Selenium 3, which was released last year. And the interesting thing about Selenium 3, there were some transition things that caught some people by surprise. First of all, the aforementioned Gecko driver was one of them. In the 2.x time frame, the default, when you just called for a new Firefox session, you used the open source version of the Firefox driver, the legacy one that was maintained and created, maintained by the open source project, the Selenium project. In version 3, and Gecko driver was an option that you had to set an option to be able to use. In Selenium 3, we flipped that. So that the default now was that you needed to use GeckoDriver by default, and to use the legacy driver, you had to set a setting. So that took a lot of people by surprise because the Selenium project doesn't ship GeckoDriver. So you have to go out and get it to be able to talk about, to talk to Firefox from Selenium. The current version, we're currently in the 3.0 timeframe, or the 3.x timeframe. The current version, shipping version of Selenium is 3.4. And that's had some of its own challenges as well. Anybody tried to use Selenium 3.4 recently, especially in a remote environment? Anybody? Yeah? Some of the challenges, especially for Firefox, are that the grid has some, the grid code or the remote code looks for a certain way of creating a new session that is incompatible, not incompatible, but is different than the way that it used to be. And in 3.4, in the language bindings, we made that, again, the default without fixing the remote server first, which was a bit of a mistake, and we're working on that. But that kind of leads us to where we are now, where we are today. And I was talking about the two modes. One of them is the open source. The other is that there is a thing called a specification. Now, does everybody know who the World Wide Web Consortium is? It's colloquially called the W3C. And if you don't know who the W3C is a group of companies, and they all get together and decide what the web's going to be. They produce these documents, these specifications, for things like CSS, how CSS is supposed to work. There's a specification for that. How JavaScript is supposed to interact with the DOM on the page. There's a spec for that. The service workers, XML HTTP requests. All of these things have specifications that are put together by the W3C. It's made up of working groups. And there was a working group that was created to codify the wire protocol that Selenium used as a W3C standard. So that is where we are today. This is a picture, by the way, of the working group, an earlier picture of the working group. This was in London a few years back. And we have a specification now, and that specification is at a state called candidate recommendation, which is the next to last stage of the W3C spec process. And what that means is that this text is mostly stable, and that implementers, that is browser vendors, can rely on the behavior that's specified in there to create their implementations. So to move from CR, or candidate recommendation, to recommendation, which is the final stage, there are a couple of things that's required. One is a test suite to test for compliance with the specification, and the other is two independent implementations of the spec. GeckoDriver is one. That is one implementation of the spec. Mozilla's GeckoDriver speaks the protocol specified by the W3C specification. The second implementation is the open source Selenium Internet Explorer driver, which now speaks the W3C version of the protocol. Now, I say the version or dialect of the protocol because when the working group was getting together, it looked at all the things that WebDriver did in the open source world, and we hopefully would have learned a few things about what to do right and what to do wrong. And so we made some improvements on the specification, or on the wire protocol. So the specs version of the protocol is slightly different than the one that the open source project has used. But it's different in just enough ways to make it not directly compatible. We have to do some tricks in the language bindings to be able to get the protocol payloads to look just right. And one of those places is in the new session command. That difference is what's causing us some grief today. And so, I say that the IE driver now implements the spec. When I say that, what I mean is that the code's checked into master, and the actual spec compliant version of the Internet Explorer driver will happen in the next public release of the Selenium project in 3.5. Now I know I've mentioned Simon Stewart, and this is a picture of Simon at the Selenium conference in Austin just a few months ago. And he is still one of the architects of the project all these years later. And he is its technical lead. And he, in fact, on the Selenium IRC channel, which I encourage all of you to jump on to the Selenium IRC channel. It's pound Selenium on the Freenode IRC network. If you prefer Slack, there is a Selenium Slack channel which is mirrored to the IRC channel, so you get both. All the conversations appear in both places. But I highly recommend that if you're interested in Selenium and you're interested in Selenium, the discussions that happen about how Selenium gets made to how it's made, that's where a lot of that stuff happens. And I highly recommend that if you're interested in that at all, please jump on. We tend to be a pretty social bunch there, and we enjoy interacting with just about anybody who has questions. But oh, and in fact, funny story. I was talking about how there's a problem with the remote server implementation because of the spec differences. That's written in Java, and Simon is kind of the Java architect. And in fact, there's even a bot in the IRC channel. And one of the commands for the bot is, who broke it? And for the longest time, it was simply hard-coded. When you typed in who broke it, it came back Simon Stewart. Actually, it still does that, but it also makes an attempt to figure out who made the last check-in that broke things. But anyway, one of the reasons we're having some challenges getting that particular thing fixed and getting a new release out is because Simon's a person, just like everybody else. He has a life outside of the Selenium project, and he, in fact, he just got married. And I mean just got married, like 2 weeks ago. In fact, I saw earlier today that he's getting ready to leave on his honeymoon to go to Italy, to Tuscany, and to spend some time in Florence and Venice. And I wish he and Pinar the best. They're wonderful people. So he's a little preoccupied from Selenium work right now. He's got other things on his mind. And a word about how the Selenium project releases software. I need to take a little bit of a moment to digress. The Selenium project is staffed entirely by volunteers. Okay? There is no company that is responsible for owning all of the code that goes into Selenium. There is a nonprofit foundation that owns the copyrights to all the code. But there's no corporate entity that employs huge numbers of people to do nothing but work on Selenium. Some of us who do work for other companies, those companies allow us to spend some of our time to donate back to the project, but that's not any of our primary responsibilities. So releases happen when there's time and coordination and when we feel like the project is ready to be released. So if you're ever wondering why does it take so long, or why is there ever an amount of time between Selenium releases, it's because, well, we just haven't gotten around to it yet. A funny story about Simon. At the Selenium conference in Boston in, what was it, 2013, Simon got up on stage and he gives a state of the project address at just about every Selenium conference. And at that time, 2.x was the thing, and we were doing rapid releases, and we said, he got up and he said, okay, we're going to have Selenium 3 by Christmas. Well, note very carefully that he didn't say Christmas of what year. And so finally, it was 2016 when we finally released Selenium 3. So that brings us up to where we are today. And now, let's chat a little bit for just a few minutes about where the project is going, okay? So the first thing is Selenium 4. In the near term, the specification is going to go to recommendation. We already have WebDriver implementations for drivers from all of the major browser vendors for the browsers that they currently support, or the browsers that are their current focus. We have one from Google for Chrome, we have one from Apple for Safari, we have one from Microsoft for Microsoft Edge. But those implementations right now do not use the spec version of the protocol. They use the old legacy open source dialect of the protocol. So in the near term, we will start to see that adoption of the spec dialect of the protocol as more browser vendors come on board with that. And all of the browser vendors have participated in the spec process. That's part of who the W3C is. The W3C working group has had members from all of the browser vendors, from Mozilla, from Microsoft, from Apple, from Google, and that's good. As the spec dialect of the protocol becomes more prevalent, that means that the next release of Selenium, the next major release of Selenium, the 4.x version, will default to that being the protocol that's used and only fall back to the OSS version of the protocol if it absolutely has to. Now, some of the challenges associated with that is that there's a large ecosystem of companion projects that go along with Selenium. In particular, I'm thinking of Appium. You know, we're all familiar with Appium. One of Appium's great advantages is that it uses that same JSON over HTTP wire protocol idea to automate its version of a driver, in this case, an application driver, right? But going forward, because of some of the changes in the protocol, that means that, and in particular, there are two areas that are really, the new session is really different. And user actions, and by that I mean like advanced actions, like doing things like drag and drop or right click or double click, or in the mobile world or in the touch world, things like tap and double tap and pinch and zoom and all that kind of thing. That's another area of the spec where the protocol has changed radically. We think for the better, both in the Selenium project and as part of the W3C working group that actually helped to write the spec. I like to hope that it's better, more flexible, gives you more ability to do more things with an unlimited number of input devices. But Appium is going to have to grow the ability to speak that version of the spec. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that as the next 2 days progress, that I'm sure there are plans to help that happen and move along. The other thing is, and again, this goes back to the new session protocol payload being different. Cloud vendors like SauceLabs currently, everybody knows about desired capabilities, right? That's one of the things that you have to shove into your payload or to be able to make your call to start a session at SauceLabs and just about anywhere else. While the OSS dialect of the protocol is very forgiving and lets you put just about anything into that payload, the W3C dialect of the protocol is much less forgiving. It's much more regimented about what you can put in that payload. And so vendors like SauceLabs, who provide the ability to start up a new session remotely with some sort of authentication and that kind of thing, are going to have to make some adjustments for how to make that happen appropriately and stay spec compliant. Because the spec mandates that if you get something that you don't like that's not spec compliant in the payload, you don't create the session, you send an error back. those are some of the things that are coming in the near term that I think we all need to be aware of. Now, longer term, anything I say from this point forward is speculation on my part. It's informed speculation, I would hope, but it is speculation. So let's take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. And I may be wrong. I may be reading things wrong, but let's gaze into the crystal ball together, just a little bit anyway. One of the things that I personally have seen over the last few years is a trend toward commercial tool vendors having at least some support for WebDriver, whether that's simply wrapping Selenium tests and being able to execute them and report on the results, or whether that's being able to actually, in their own tool, use WebDriver as part of their automation system. And I think that trend is only going to continue going forward. And I say that because once you have the people who know the browser best designing a way to automate that browser, if you are going and designing your own way of automating the browser, that's really reinventing the wheel and not necessarily doing it in a way that's guaranteed to continue to be supported by that browser. So I think we're going to see that continue as a trend, is that commercial tool vendors, and by that I mean folks like HPE with their LeanFT product, or SmartBear with their Test Complete product, and so on, vendors like that, to continue to integrate WebDriver code into their products more tightly and better. There are some holdouts in that space for now, and I'm not going to name them because we've had some back and forth that hasn't gone as nicely as I would like for it to happen. But I think I think they're on the wrong side of history if they decide to continue to do their own thing rather than leveraging what the browser vendors give you. But I think that eventually that will fall away. Other things that will continue in the longer term. Right now, there is a legacy Firefox driver, one that was created by the project, the Selenium project, maintained by the Selenium project, implemented as a browser extension. That part of the project is going to go away completely eventually. And Gecko driver is going to be the way forward. It's going to be the only way to be able to automate Firefox. That's probably going to happen within the next year. I get asked a lot, what about the IE driver, right? Is Microsoft going to do an IE driver? Because, they create IE, so maybe they ought to. I agitated Microsoft for years to create an IE driver. I tried really hard, y'all. And, there were some fits and starts and some movements in that area. And then when Windows 10 came out, Microsoft decided to go a slightly different way. They decided to do away with a lot of the cruft of IE and essentially fork their own browser, right? Fork their own project and create Microsoft Edge. And they're really excited about Microsoft Edge. That's where they're putting all of their development resources for new browser work, for new feature work for browsers. And that's understandably so. People want to work on the latest and greatest. And they have a WebDriver implementation for Microsoft Edge, which is great. That implementation will never support Internet Explorer. That's just the way it goes. They want to spend their time and effort, their limited time and effort, because development resources are limited. They're not unlimited, even for a company as big as Microsoft. They want to spend that time thinking and working on Microsoft Edge. So that leaves the Internet Explorer driver in the open source world. And I had a conversation a couple of years ago with a man named John Jansen, who is a product manager at Microsoft, works on the web platform team. He works on the team that he kind of helps to run the team that creates Edge and creates IE. And he said, he said to me, we were not far from here in Mountain View having a drink. And he said to me, we really thought long and hard about an IE driver when we were doing this whole Edge split. We really thought, can we justify doing some sort of way to have a driver that does both, or spend some resources helping out with Internet Explorer. And they came to the conclusion, and this is, I won't say the direct quote because decorum prevents me from what he actually said. He said, but it came up in the meeting that there's this open source driver for IE and it works pretty darn well. Darned was not the word he used. And so we're going to let that, the community solution, continue to be the solution for Internet Explorer. So the Selenium project's promise going forward, and this is my personal promise because it's my code, is that we will continue to support the Internet Explorer driver as a going concern as long as Internet Explorer is a supported driver by Windows. And we will continue to keep that going forward as long as we can. So what does that mean for the project long term? Well, the project starts to slim down a little bit. The Selenium project itself starts to slim down a little bit. Essentially, you're left with the language bindings, which are not going to go anywhere. And that's language bindings for C#, or .NET, I should say, Java, Ruby, Python, and JavaScript. There's a test suite associated, or several test suites actually, because one for each language binding. There are test suites that live in the project as part of that continue to live as part of the project. There's some JavaScript common code that even browser vendors use as part of their implementations for WebDrivers, and that continues to live in the Selenium project. And that's really about it that lives in the Selenium project going forward. Now, there are a few things that will continue going forward, but I'm not entirely sure that I see the way forward for them, and I don't know what form they're going to take. First of all, the documentation on the Selenium project. We know, okay? We know, the docs are horrible. We know it, we get it. And we really want to try to improve those, but I'm not sure what form that's going to take and how we're going to get that done. Because none of us who currently contribute code to the project are great technical writers and who can really write engaging documentation that people can actually use. So that's one thing that we just kind of don't know how that's going to shake out in the future. We know that we're going to do some improvements there, but we just don't know what they're going to be and how it's going to take, what form it's going to take. Record and playback. One of the reasons that Selenium was so completely successful at sort of kind of winning the automation war against commercial tools was the availability of a record and playback tool, Selenium IDE. And there hasn't been any movement on Selenium IDE. It's very long in the tooth right now. It's very old and outdated. It still primarily uses the Selenium RC sort of metaphor for the commands that it has available to it. And that's really because, again, it's a volunteer project and people work on what they want to work on, right? You can't force volunteers to do something other than what they want to do, right? And it's not a priority for any of us because most of us don't believe in the long-term viability of record playback as a mechanism for generating maintainable, elegant code. Record and playback has its uses. It has uses for when you're first learning. It has uses for doing one-off things that you don't intend to maintain and keep running over and over again. But for the majority of those who are actually committers in the project right now, it's just not a priority. The efforts to improve it come in kind of fits and starts. There was a summit meeting after the last Selenium conference in London in 2015, I guess it was. No, 2016, in London, about what the next Selenium IDE would look like. There's been work for Selenium Builder that was originally built by SauceLabs, the people at SauceLabs, and that code and intellectual property was donated to the Selenium project, but nothing's ever been done with it. We just, again, we're going to do something. I just don't, for myself, really know what the form that's going to take yet. I just can't see it. The other thing is, and this is kind of a personal thing for me, is that there's a library that's companion that ships with most of the Selenium language bindings that is kind of usually in a support namespace. Like in the .NET world, for example, is a separate assembly. It's WebDriver.support.dll, right? And it includes things like WebDriver wait and the page factory, if you use the page factory for your page object model work, and so on and so on. And for most of those projects, or for most of the things in that namespace, the code that's there was originally intended to simply be examples of some of the things you could do with WebDriver. Some of the things that you could, some of the utilities you could build yourself to leverage for WebDriver. In particular, I think of the page factory. The page factory was intended originally to be an example of this is something you could do. But because it shipped with the Selenium project, a lot of people used it as this is the way you have to create page objects. No, it's not. It's a way you might create page objects. You don't have to use a page factory for page objects. There are plenty of other ways to do it. But going forward, I would be willing to bet that, except for WebDriver wait, because that is such an important construct, that most of those things may move out to companion projects that are not shipped with Selenium anymore in the future. I'm not saying it's going to happen today. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow. I'm not even saying it's going to happen in a year, but I would not be surprised if down the line that is not what happens.
Before Christmas.
Before Christmas, yes. So the future is pretty bright for Selenium, I think. I think it's got a long life ahead of it. It's 13 years old now. I think it's got a good long life ahead of it, and I'm proud to be a part of it. I hope you get some use out of the project, and that I hope you'll be inspired to build your own things on top of it, and even to help come and help contribute to it. I'm going to be around for the rest of the conference if you have questions about things about Selenium, about, hey, why did Selenium do this thing this way? I'm probably a pretty good resource to figure that out. Or, hey, what do you think is going to happen with this in Selenium? I can help to answer those questions. So feel free to come up and chat with me and about that over the next couple of days if you have questions, or at the reception tonight. But listen, y'all have been an incredibly attentive, and I don't think I've put too many people to sleep first thing in the morning. So you've been incredibly generous with your time and attention as I've rambled on for a little while about the Selenium project. And for that, all I can say is thank you.